Angelina leaned back slightly, her posture regal, her voice now carrying a steel edge. I owe them honesty about the issues that matter. I owe them clarity about the suffering I've witnessed, the crises I've worked in. What I do not owe is the intimacy of my children's pain or the theater of my divorce. That is not transparency. That is exploitation. Gasps scattered through the room, followed by a wave of applause that drowned the band's attempt at a soft musical cue. The energy had shifted. The crowd wasn't here for gossip anymore. They were here for revelation. Kelly's composure cracked just briefly, her lips tightening, her eyes darting toward the cameras. She had lost her rhythm. The control that usually flowed so easily from her was slipping away. The woman across from her was not a guest to be managed. She was a witness delivering testimony. Angelina's voice softened, but its weight only deepened. I came here to discuss children displaced by war, children whose names will never trend, children who die before anyone bothers to write their stories. If we cannot give them a moment on a stage like this, then what is the point of this conversation? The audience erupted once more, cheers and claps echoing against the studio walls. Some stood to their feet, swept by the force of her words. It no longer felt like a show. It felt like a trial, the verdict forming in real time. Kelly straightened. In her chair, cards clutched tighter now. Her voice pitched upward, cheerful but strained. Well, Angelina, you certainly have a way with words. Angelina's lips pressed into a half smile, not smug but resolute. Words are all some people have left. It's our responsibility to use them well. And with that, the ground beneath the interview had shifted permanently. The courtroom was no longer Kelly's stage. Angelina Jolie had seized it, turning questions meant to diminish her into indictments against the culture that demanded them. The cross-examination had begun, and Kelly, for the first time, was not in control. The set was dressed like every other morning show. Glossy mugs, pastel flowers, a cushioned couch. But as the conversation twisted, as Kelly Ripa pressed harder and Angelina Jolie refused to yield, something in the air changed. The studio no longer felt like entertainment, it felt like trial. The lights glaring overhead became interrogation lamps. The audience rows became wooden benches where jurors sat, waiting for evidence. And the hosts' cue cards? They were exhibits in a case of control versus conscience. Kelly's voice shifted, taking on the cadence of a prosecutor who smelled weakness. She leaned forward, her words carefully sharpened. But Angelina, don't you think your choices, your travels, your advocacy, even your decisions as a mother, bring challenges for your children? Don't you worry what all of this does to them? It was phrased as concern, but the implication was clear. Your work, your life, your identity. It's a burden on your family. The audience hushed, leaning in. The question carried weight, the kind that cut not only at reputation but at motherhood itself. It was the oldest courtroom tactic, attack not the argument, but the witness's character. Angelina did not flinch. She adjusted slightly in her seat, crossing one leg with slow deliberation, and then she delivered her response like sworn testimony. What harms children most is not their parents' courage. What harms them most is indifference. Indifference from the comfortable. Indifference from the privileged. Indifference from people who would rather debate a woman's choices than acknowledge a child starving in a camp. The studio broke into applause, thunderous and immediate. It was not the polite clapping of morning cheer. It was visceral, like the roar of jurors stirred by truth. Kelly's smile froze, stiffening. At the edges, her grip tightening on the cue cards as if they might steady her. She tried to pivot, voice smooth but strained. I think what our viewers want is to understand both sides. You, the global humanitarian, but also you, the mom at home. Isn't it fair to say that both stories matter? Jolie's eyes narrowed, not cruelly, but with the certainty of someone who had faced senators, soldiers, survivors. Her reply landed heavy, each syllable deliberate. Both stories matter, but one of them, the personal, already has a stage it never asked for. The other, the children without homes, the women without safety, has no stage at all. If I have, This microphone, I will not waste it retelling gossip when I could use it to give them a voice. The room erupted again. This time the applause wasn't just support. It was judgment. The audience, the so-called jury, had begun choosing sides. Kelly's laugh rang out, practiced and bright, but the mask had thinned. I just think our viewers appreciate the balance of light and heavy. We all need some levity. Angelina leaned in, her tone lower now, almost intimate yet edged with steel. Levity is welcome. Distraction is not. Entertainment without conscience becomes complicity, and I won't be complicit. The silence that followed was electric. Even the crew, behind the camera, stilled, caught in the shift of gravity. Kelly had framed herself as the arbiter, the one who guided tone, but Jolie had redefined the rules entirely. In that moment, the courtroom metaphor crystallized. Kelly was no longer the unquestioned host. She was the prosecutor whose case was slipping. Her questions felt less like banter and more like cross-examination, and Jolie's replies were no longer celebrity anecdotes. They were testimonies of moral indictment. The jury, seated in rows of bright studio chairs and millions more behind screens at home, was already forming its verdict. For years, Kelly Ripa had presided over mornings like a judge in robes of charm. But now the gavel was no longer hers. Angelina Jolie had seized it, wielding truth not as performance but as evidence. And the trial, though it had only just begun, was already tilting in her favor. The cameras caught everything, the flicker in Kelly's eyes, the sharpness in Jolie's voice, the audience leaning forward spellbound. What had started as a routine interview had transformed into something else entirely. A public trial of what America chooses to watch and what it chooses to ignore. And as the applause thundered again, it became clear that Kelly was not simply interviewing a guest. She was standing opposite a witness whose testimony could not be contained. The courtroom was alive, the jury awake, and the trial was far from over. At first, the studio audience had played their part like any other morning crowd, laughing when cued, applauding politely at introductions, sipping from branded mugs handed out before airtime. But somewhere between Jolie's first sharp rebuttal and her refusal to play along with the tabloid script, something shifted. The energy inside the room no longer belonged to Kelly Ripa. It belonged to the woman across from her, the one who spoke less like a guest and more like a witness under oath. Kelly tried to reset the tone, lifting her shoulders, voice pitching, brighter. You have such a powerful way of seeing the world, Angelina. But sometimes people just want to escape, don't you think? To focus on lighter things. She laughed, glancing at the audience for affirmation. I mean, isn't that why we all watch these shows? The smile lingered, but it found little traction. The audience chuckled out of habit, but their laughter was thin, fading quickly. Then Jolie leaned forward, her posture precise, her tone like a knife sheathed in velvet. Escapism is a luxury, she said. For millions of families, there is no escape. There is no light-hearted moment when you're searching for clean water. Entertainment can give comfort, but when it blinds us to suffering, it stops being relief and starts being denial. The audience gasped, and then the clapping came again. Louder, longer this time. People shifted in their seats, drawn toward her gravity. Kelly's practiced laugh trembled at the edges, caught between irritation and disbelief. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances, sensing the storm. In the control booth, the director's voice crackled. Stay wide. Don't cut away. We're trending if this keeps up. Screens flickered with live feeds of Twitter already exploding, clips posted within seconds, captions screaming in capital letters. Angelina checks Kelly on live TV. Kelly tried once more, pressing a smile, like plaster over a crack. But surely our viewers want to see both sides, the serious and the silly. It's about balance. Angelina's eyes didn't move from her. Her voice, calm and unwavering, carried the finality of a closing statement. Balance is not giving. Gossip equal weight to suffering. Balance is knowing which story matters most when you're given the privilege of a platform. The applause was deafening. Some in the studio rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor that felt more like solidarity than entertainment. The cameras swung wide to capture it, their lenses catching faces lit with conviction. No longer passive spectators, but jurors swayed by the testimony. Kelly's jaw tensed. She shuffled her cards, papers that now felt useless in her hands. The conversation had slipped entirely from her grasp. What she meant as soft provocation had turned into a referendum on her role, her show, and the entire architecture of distraction she represented. And outside, beyond the studio walls, the tide was surging faster. Hashtags bloomed across social media like wildfire. Commentators posted, journalists clipped, and viewers at home replayed the moment with captions of disbelief and praise. Within minutes, Jolie's words were no longer confined to one stage. They were everywhere, dissected, shared, elevated. Back inside the studio, Kelly forced another smile, tilting her head. Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. The words were meant as closure, but her tone betrayed her, tight, defensive, brittle. Angelina only nodded, serene, yet unrelenting, her presence steady as a mountain. She didn't gloat, she didn't soften. She simply let the silence hang, a silence heavy with the reality that the courtroom had shifted, the jury had ruled, and the host was no longer in command. The audience's allegiance was clear now. They weren't clapping for Kelly's banter. They weren't nodding at her jokes. They were answering to something greater, truth laid bare in real time. The turn had come, swift and irreversible. And as the cameras rolled on, Kelly Ripa, for the first time in years, sat not as the unquestioned queen of daytime, but as a prosecutor who had lost her jury. The applause from Jolie's last rebuttal still echoed, but what followed was not just noise. It was silence. The kind of silence that hangs in a courtroom after a witness delivers a statement too true to dismiss. Kelly Ripa straightened in her chair, her smile taut, her fingers tightening on the cue cards that suddenly felt more like a shield than a script. She tried to reassert her rhythm, tilting her head with charm. You've always been such a role model, Angelina. Women admire you for your strength, your independence. But do you think maybe people also just want to see you as a woman? A wife? A mother? Someone they can relate to? The question, posed sweetly, landed like a dagger cloaked in silk. It wasn't about curiosity. It was about framing, about pulling Jolie back into a box audiences were meant to recognize and feel comfortable with. Angelina inhaled slowly, her eyes dropping for a beat before rising again with the weight of years carved into them. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of restrained fury. What people want is not always what they need. Women are not here to be palatable. We are not here to be trimmed down into something safe for morning television. A murmur swept through the crowd. Kelly shifted, her posture unbroken but her confidence beginning to fray. She smiled tighter, pressing further. But surely, women everywhere feel connected by those everyday struggles, by family, by marriage, by heartbreak. Don't you think that's just as important as politics? Angelina's gaze sharpened and the words came like testimony. Yes, heartbreak connects us. Motherhood connects us. But what truly connects us is survival. I have seen mothers in refugee camps clinging to their children with nothing left to give but hope. And here, on stages like this, we reduce womanhood to dresses, diets, and divorces. Do you not see the insult in that? The audience gasped, and then the applause broke again, louder this time, urgent, rising in waves that rattled the studio's polished calm. Kelly's smile flickered, but she held her ground. Well, I think our viewers just want to know that even someone like you has the same struggles they do. That's empowering. Angelina leaned forward, her voice low, steady, piercing through the air. Empowerment is not watching a woman's struggles turned into spectacle. Empowerment is giving women the dignity of being more than their wounds. Empowerment is saying, your pain is real, but so is your power. The words landed heavy, stirring the crowd like a sermon. Some clapped, some nodded silently. Others sat with their faces softened by recognition. It was no longer just an interview. It was a mirror held up to every woman in the room and every woman watching at home. Kelly hesitated, her next line caught in her throat. For the first time, she looked less like a judge and more like someone standing trial. Her attempts to frame womanhood as polished relatability were dissolving under Jolie's relentless insistence that womanhood was something raw, weightier, uncontainable. Angelina's voice trembled slightly now, but not with weakness, rather with the strain of truth carried too long. When a child dies in Syria, do you ask who their mother dated? When a girl in Congo is assaulted, do you wonder what designer she was wearing? Is that the measure of our concern? The silence that followed was crushing. Not a laugh, not a clap, not even a cough broke it. The words had scorched the room, and their echo lingered. Kelly's face froze, her eyes darting briefly to the cameras as if searching for a lifeline. The audience had shifted entirely. They were no longer watching a conversation. They were witnessing a clash of worlds. Womanhood as glossy presentation versus womanhood as unflinching survival. And in that crucible of silence, the question emerged, not one spoken aloud, but one pressed into every viewer's conscience. Which version of womanhood deserves the stage? The answer was already forming in the heavy air, and Kelly Ripa knew it wasn't hers. The lights of the studio gleamed with artificial warmth, bright enough to blur edges and soften flaws, but too sharp to conceal tension. Daytime television had always been designed to appear harmless. Pastel backdrops, polished mugs on glass, tables easy chatter that slipped like water through the cracks of a long afternoon. Yet on this particular day the air felt heavy, like the stillness before a courtroom trial begins when the jury settles, and the gavel has not yet fallen. Adele sat at the panel, her figure framed by the brightness, her presence commanding without effort. She had not come to be tried. She had come, or so it was scheduled, to be celebrated. A voice of a generation, a working-class girl from Tottenham, who had risen to heights so few ever touched. But the audience watching at home, the live studio, attendees, even the women sitting around the table with her, could feel it in the air. There was a reckoning brewing. Denise Welch leaned in, her expression casual, her body language cloaked in the friendly armor of daytime banter. Yet her eyes told another story. She was not merely a host this afternoon. She was an interrogator, sharpening her questions like blades. The moderator's opening remarks floated away quickly, the way legal formalities do before the first strike in a heated trial. Cameras zoomed closer. The audience clapped politely, unaware that they were about to witness more than conversation. They were about to watch a collision. Adele shifted in her chair, her smile faint but already tight around the edges. She had played this role countless times before, the smiling guest, offering anecdotes, warmth, relatability. But every star knows when an interview takes a turn. Every defendant senses when questioning is no longer a courtesy, but a cross-examination. Denise cleared her throat softly, tilting her head as though concerned. Adele, people love you because you've always been so open. But lately, some say you've become guarded. The fans want to know why so distant now. It was not yet explosive, but the cadence, the insinuation, struck like the first crack of a whip. The audience leaned forward, not because the words were scandalous, but because the tone was. Adele's eyes flickered toward her. A pause hung in the air. Her reply came measured, her voice low and calm as though choosing every word with care. I've never stopped loving my fans. But loving them doesn't mean I owe every piece of my life to be displayed. The clash was subtle, almost polite. Yet beneath it throbbed centuries of unspoken battles. The artist's right to privacy against the public's hunger for access. The individual's dignity against the marketplace's demand. The audience clapped again, but softer now. Unsure if this was applause for wit or sympathy for a wound. The set lights flickered slightly as though straining to hold the atmosphere. Denise leaned back, her smile widening, but not with warmth. It was the smile of a barrister sensing the witness was on edge. But don't you think that part of what makes you who you are, Adele, is that connection? That people feel entitled to share in your struggles? Because you've sung them so beautifully for us? There it was. The unspoken accusation, dressed as affection. The suggestion that Adele had turned her back on the very intimacy that built her empire. Adele drew in a breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The cameras caught it, the slight tremor, the restrained frustration. I've given everything I can through my music. That's the truest connection I know how to offer. My life outside of that, my son, my family, that's mine. That doesn't belong to the world. A hush fell over the set. It was the kind of silence that occurs not from boredom, but from recognition. The audience realized they were no longer spectators to entertainment. They were witnesses to testimony. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered into a headset, "Stay on her face. Don't cut away." Because this was the moment. Adele's jaw tightening, Denise's eyebrows arching, the other panelists, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, caught in the crossfire but unwilling to intervene. It was not yet shouting. It was not yet storming out. But the trial had begun, and the jury and millions of viewers had just been sworn in. The live audience shifted in their chairs, murmurs hushed quickly, like townspeople silenced by a bailiff's call. The stage was no longer a stage. It was a courtroom, and the verdict was not yet written. Beneath the studio's painted calm, the true battle lines began to show. The pastel colors and cheerful chatter were only a veil. What unfolded was not entertainment but conflict, two worlds colliding under the disguise of casual daytime television. Adele had entered the set not as just another guest, but as a cultural figure whose very existence challenged the rules of fame. She was Britain's daughter of grit and grief, the voice that poured pain into melody, who had offered the world not spectacle but soul. Denise Welch sat across from her, embodying another Britain entirely, blunt, unsentimental, unfiltered. To the viewers, Denise was the every woman who never softened her edges, the courtroom prosecutor of loose women who made her living pressing where others would tread lightly. The exchange carried undertones that reached beyond the set. It wasn't simply one celebrity and one presenter. It was something larger, something archetypal, authenticity battling scrutiny, privacy against exposure, a voice that asked to be heard only in song against a voice that demanded explanation, demanded confession. The air tightened as Denise leaned forward again. But don't you see, Adele? The people who bought your albums, who supported you through everything, they don't just want the music. They want you. They want to know the woman behind the voice. Don't you think it's fair to give a little more back? Her tone was soft, measured like a barrister cross-examining a witness, but the question hit like an accusation. It wasn't curiosity. It was pressure. Adele blinked slowly, her lashes lowering as though shielding herself from a glare. I give myself in every note I sing. That's not nothing, Denise, that's everything. When I write about heartbreak, when I sing about loss, I'm opening veins. I'm not sure what more people expect of me. The words dropped heavy, a declaration, yet there was a tremor beneath them. The exhaustion of a witness being asked to recount the same trauma again and again for a hungry jury. The other panelists tried to soften the air, offering quick interjections, a laugh here, a nod there, but they were background figures now. The duel belonged only to Adele and Denise, their exchange filling every corner of the room. The studio audience shifted, whispers slipping like rustling paper. Some tilted their heads sympathetically toward Adele, sensing her fatigue. Others leaned into Denise's argument. Wasn't it fair, after all, that the public who had crowned Adele wanted to share in the intimacy she once gave freely? A young woman in the audience covered her mouth, whispering to her neighbor, "It feels like she's on trial." And she was right. The set had become a courtroom, and every pair of eyes was fixed on the defendant at the center. Denise's hand tapped lightly against the desk, the rhythm deliberate, like a judge punctuating each word. "But Adele," she pressed, "don't you think closing yourself off now feels like a betrayal? Like you've forgotten where you came from?" The word betrayal hung like a charge sheet. Adele's back straightened, her shoulders stiff as if struck. Her response came low, quiet, but the restraint only sharpened its edge. "I've never forgotten where I come from. I've carried it in every song, every lyric. But I didn't fight my way out of those streets to hand over my private life like some public trophy. Fame doesn't mean surrender. The audience clapped, louder now, a divided jury voicing its split decision. Some cheered for Adele's defiance. Others shook their heads, murmuring that Welch was only asking what the people had a right to know. And there it was, the deeper conflict buried beneath casual conversation. It wasn't about one question or one answer. It was about entitlement. What society demands from those it elevates. It was about whether a woman, even one who sang her soul raw, was ever allowed to say, enough. The set was bright and polished, but in the undercurrent there was shadow, weight, consequence. The moment was no longer a mere interview. It had transformed into an ideological trial. Adele sat still, her fingers clasped together tightly in her lap, the faintest white pressing against her knuckles. She was calm, but every inch of her body carried tension, the quiet resolve of someone bracing under interrogation. Denise smiled, tilting her head, satisfied that she had pressed where it hurt. The other panelists exchanged uneasy glances, each aware that they were no longer part of friendly television, but witnesses to a conflict neither side was prepared to lose. The audience clapped again, some nervously, some gleefully, and the cameras panned to Adele's face, the steel in her eyes, the fire restrained beneath her calm. The trial was underway, and as the studio lights gleamed above, 1,000 living rooms across Britain fell into silence, waiting for the verdict of a battle that was only just beginning. The panel desk gleamed beneath the studio lights, but the brightness only sharpened the lines of confrontation. What had begun as polite sparring was shifting into something harder, more deliberate. Denise Welch no longer looked like a casual host tossing questions in the air. She had assumed a new posture, leaning forward with both elbows pressed to the table, her voice steadier, colder. It was the stance of a prosecutor who had decided the time for courtesy was over.